Good evening. My name is Diane Proctor. I sit on the steering committee of the Coalition for Stopping Private Jet Expansion at Hanscom or anywhere, and wish to thank you. And that includes all the prominent people we know who have been recently flying on jets, and wish to thank you for joining us this evening. We have over 550 participants registered in our webinar, ranging from 71 Massachusetts towns and cities, from Dorchester to Pittsfield, and 12 different states from Alabama and Georgia to Washington State. The representation of interest is broad and exciting. Additionally, I wish to thank the League of Women Voters from Concord Carlisle and the Massachusetts Sierra Club for co-sponsoring this evening's program. The Coalition to Stop Private Jet Expansion was formed in last May by 10 local groups, motivated and inspired by activists like the Swedish Greta Thunberg, who commented as early as 2019, "We kids most often don't do what you tell us to do." I wish I had a good Swedish accent. "And since you grown-ups don't give a damn about my future, I have to act myself. My name is Greta. I'm in 9th grade, and I am a school striking for the climate until the election." And closer to home, John Lewis has urged us to speak up, speak out, get in the way, get into good trouble, necessary trouble. So in less than a year, our efforts have grown to over 70 organizations from Boston to the Berkshires. Last October, 250 concerned citizens delivered over 10,000 petition signatures to Governor Healy at a State House rally focusing on the environmentally irresponsible expansion at Hanscom. The event was covered by numerous major media outlets. Today, we are nearly 14,000 petition signatures, and the coalition continues to grow in numbers and impact. In truth, the eyes of the world are upon us, for this is a cause that involves all of us, for the health of our children, our grandchildren, and our living environment. We will hear first tonight from Naomi Oreskes. She will be followed by 3 distinguished speakers. After everyone has spoken, participants will have ample time for questions and responses. Please record any questions you have in the chat box, and we will do our best to express your thoughts and questions and present them to the panel. So let us begin. Naomi Oreskes will provide special remarks regarding the expansion at Hanscom and its implications. She is a world-renowned public speaker on science, climate change, and corporate efforts to undermine climate action. She is a professor of history of science and an affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University. She is the author of numerous books and articles and co-author with Eric Conway of the remarkable work Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Climate Change. And more recently and powerfully, The Big Myth: How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. Well, they didn't teach us all, did they, Naomi? She is an inspiration to us all. Welcome, Professor Oreskes.
So thank you all so much. Thanks for that kind introduction. And especially thank you to everyone who's here tonight and who's taking the time to be involved in this important issue. I'm here to lend my support to the effort to stop the expansion of private jets at Hanscom and everywhere because of its potential to aggravate the climate crisis. The importance of this issue is reflected in how many of us are here tonight. You've already heard there are several hundred people registered for this webinar from all across Massachusetts, 71 cities and towns across the state, from Acton to Worcester. And if there were a town that began with Z, I'm sure they would be here too. I think I don't have to tell you how important it is for us to act on climate change, but just as a small reminder that the climate crisis is unfolding even as we sit here tonight. Even as we gather here, over 1 million acres of land have burned in Texas. Officials estimate by the time this fire is contained, it will be 2 million acres. Thousands of livestock have been killed. Hundreds of homes have been destroyed, and one firefighter has lost his life. The monetary damages are likely to be counted in the many tens, if not hundreds of millions. And that is just this week. Throughout this past year, California has suffered the impact of atmospheric rivers, which have dumped unprecedented quantities of rain and snow on the state, leading in turn to floods and mudslides. The losses associated with just one weekend in February, the weekend of February 3rd, 4th, just a month ago, have been estimated at $9 to $11 billion. Across the globe, communities have been devastated by unprecedented floods, fires, heat waves, and droughts, which science demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt have been brought to these unprecedented levels by the effects of man-made climate change driven by carbon pollution and other greenhouse gases. The International Monetary Fund estimates the annual costs of man-made climate change is $1.5 trillion every single year. Now, these numbers are so big that they can be hard to absorb. The problem can seem overwhelming, and it may feel like there's not much we as individuals or small communities can do. But there are things we can do, things that can and will make a real difference if we do them. And we are here tonight to do one of those things, to stop the expansion of private jets at Hanscom Field and everywhere. So why is this important? Well, first, transportation is a major cause of carbon pollution. In the United States, transportation accounts for 29% of all greenhouse gas pollution. That makes it the number one sector above agriculture, heavy industry, home heating and lighting, and anything else you can think of. So just remember that if someone asks you, why does this matter? Transportation is the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in this country. And about half of that comes from aviation. Now, here's a key fact to remember that you'll hear again later tonight. A typical trip in a private jet produces 45 times as much carbon pollution as the same trip on a commercial flight. That's right, 45 times as much. That's huge. So we're not talking about small differences here. We're talking about differences that are enormous. Now, one reason climate change is a tough issue is because it confronts many real needs. We all need to heat our homes. We all need to get to work. Or if we have the luxury of working at home, then we need light and electricity at home for work. And we all need to be able to shop for essentials. Some of us can do these things without using fossil fuels, but many of us can't. But no one needs to fly in a private jet. And when they do, they undermine the real progress that we are making elsewhere. So here's another key fact you'll hear tonight, and I hope you'll remember. Just 1 year of private jet emissions at Hanscom negates 50% of all the carbon pollution that is avoided by all the solar photovoltaic power in Massachusetts, all of it. And if this proposed expansion goes ahead, that 50% will become 70%. So this means that the huge amount of hard work, time, money, commitment, and effort that has gone into expanding solar power in this state will be undone. And for what? For the convenience of a tiny handful of very rich people. So let's not let that happen. It's not just about protecting our backyard. It's about protecting everyone's backyard and their front yards too.
Thank you so much, Professor Oreskes. And of course, you're reminding us that this is not a NIMBY issue, is it? It is an issue that has a huge effect on the entire environment in which we live here in Massachusetts and actually across the country. If we look at some of the examples that Europe is undertaking to stop private jets, it should be a model for all of us. Thank you for those inspiring words. Next, we have Neil Rasmussen. He is president of Save Our Heritage. He has used his formidable energies and deep knowledge of climate and energy issues to help us understand and highlight the environmental impact and concerns of this planned expansion. He shall provide us with important insights into the challenges we face. Every time I hear Neil speak, I learn something new and something important. Welcome, Neil, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Diane. Am I able to share my screen?
We can see it.
Yes, and it's doing beautifully.
All right. So I know most of you feel there's a lot of doom and gloom about this climate issue, and you all wish you could do something about it. And every now and then, there's a big opportunity to do something about it, and this is such a case. So what I want to explain, this particular project has three major issues that warrant our concern specifically. One is it generates an obscene amount of greenhouse gas emissions. The second is it has no societal value. And the third is that in addition to those first two terrible things, it also is highly subsidized by you, the taxpayer. And I'd like to go explain why all those things are true. So this particular picture is an image of the plan of the project. And it's hard to understand it exactly, but you can see there's these things called hangars out there. And the scope of the project is enormous. It's 2/3 of a mile in length. And to get a scale on these individual hangars, in the middle of the picture, you see a little dot that says size of a typical house. And that just shows you how enormous these hangars are. And each one of them can hold multiple jets, and together they can hold almost 80. Recently, the proponents announced that they have reduced the number of hangars in the project, but they didn't explain that the area of those hangars is just as big. So in fact, the hangars can actually have this more than the capacity they had in the original proposal as far as how many jets they can hold. So what is the project? Let's just outline this briefly. It expands the private jet infrastructure at the airport by a huge factor. It represents the single largest development in the history of the airport, for sure. And it actually represents the largest project in Massachusetts that we've seen for a very long time that generates new greenhouse gases. It relieves the current jet capacity constraints at the airport. And it supports the planned growth of the luxury jet industry. Now, let's be honest. Massachusetts has a housing problem. We have some homeless private jets that need housing. But it's hard to fathom how we could be prioritizing housing these homeless private jets at a time when we have a real crisis for people. But that's what the state is doing. And it's not just any project. It's the largest private jet luxury project known in America, possibly in the world. Now, in Massachusetts, we care about these things for sure. And for example, we have this very interesting law of 2021, the climate roadmap, that has a net zero requirement by 2050. And it has a very interesting feature, which requires every category, every subsector has to, by itself, have its own declining emissions profile. And that's very important to think about. And of course, the towns and other industries and so on have been thinking about this plan. And in our case, the 4 towns that surround the airport have their own plans to fall in line with the state plan. And you can see them on this graph here, focused around they currently have like 250,000 tons of CO2 generated per year, according to their greenhouse gas inventories in the towns, and plan to decline over the years. This is going to be an extreme challenge. And originally, it should be fairly easy to keep on that plan for a few years. But after a point of time, there's going to be sacrifices and very hard work to hit these plans. Well, what about the airport? Now, this is the same graph as the previous one, but the 4 towns are down at the bottom in this. And you can see them crunched down there around 250,000 tons a year, declining with great effort as if they achieve that. Meanwhile, let's take a look at these red lines, which represent 3 different growth scenarios for Hanscom emissions. Today, they're already over 600,000 tons per year, but they're climbing. And the rate of climb is remarkable. The industry projects 10% growth per year for the next decades. That, even if that is hit, it'll be a huge amount of increase. And at the bottom end, I have a 2% growth rate, which corresponds to the commercial, the growth of commercial flights, which everybody agrees is well below what private jets are going to do. So if we take private jets in the mid-range of this, you can see that by, out by 2040 or so, it produces more greenhouse gases than like 20 or 30 towns. And here's an incredible statistic. Boston has a climate plan that is shown in the green line that started way off the top of the chart and is coming down. And by 2040, Hanscom alone, the private jets alone, will be greater than the entire greenhouse gas emissions of the city of Boston. That just puts this in perspective. And what do we need to support that kind of growth? Hangar development. And you can see here a curve that shows a remarkable shape of upswing in hangar development, including some of the latest projects, along with the current proposed project, having the classic hockey stick type form. What enables this growth? Clearly, it's infrastructure. And what are we talking about? How do we come up with these numbers for the emissions for these aircraft? Well, the math is fairly straightforward. There's 38,000 jet operations per year, private jet operations. And we don't know how exactly what their flight times are, but assuming they're about 2.5 hours, and then assuming their use is about 330 gallons per hour, which is the average. There's some that are 250 and some that are 600. But on average, it's about 330. And then the amount of CO2 generated per gallon of jet fuel is determined by basic chemistry. And in addition to CO2, there are additional greenhouse gas effects from flying jets. And those effects, when they've been analyzed, basically double the greenhouse gas effects compared to the CO2 effects. So there's a multiplier of 2 to get the CO2e, which is a measure of greenhouse gas emissions, compared to just the carbon emissions. So from all this, you can figure out that a single flight generates about 20 tons, and all the flights together are currently generating 600 to 700,000 tons a year. And just to put that in perspective, a car, like a gas car, is responsible for about 5 tons a year, which is less than a quarter of a single flight. So let's just again think about putting this in perspective. As Naomi said, that those numbers that I just gave you caused the emissions from just the private jets at Hanscom to cancel out half the greenhouse gas gains that we achieved by installing all the solar that's ever been installed in Massachusetts. That's incredible when you think about it. How do you feel when you put a solar array on your house and celebrate your progress when that the output of that array represents only like less than a single flight a year from Hanscom? It's sad to feel that your progress that you're trying to make is being offset that way. And of course, as I pointed out earlier from those graphs, the growth alone proposed at the airport completely cancels out the 2050 climate gains of the local communities. And, what is the benefit of all of this? So some people at this point say, wait a minute, there's a Hanscom Air Force Base. That does something useful for the economy, right? I want to be clear. The Air Force Base has nothing to do with the airport. It's a neighbor of the airport. And before the 70s, it had leased some of the airport for purposes of aviation, but that all went away in the 70s. And currently, the Air Force Base does cybersecurity and satellite work, nothing to do with airplanes. So it gets a little confusing because they have the same name. But what do we know about the societal benefit? We know it serves only a few individuals. That's a fact. And what is it for? Well, it services primarily resort destinations, and that's been reported in the Wall Street Journal and other reports. You'll hear more about that a little later. An incredible statistic is that one round trip to Asia in a private jet emits more greenhouse gases than a rural family in India does in their entire lifetime. So how can we go to other countries, developing nations, and tell them to, save their use of fertilizer or do other things to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while we have this obscene activity going on in our own country? It's really a form of social injustice. Now, are private jets necessary for the economy? Massport says so. They say, oh, these jets are critical to enabling our businesses to compete in the global economy and generate jobs. But how do they advertise these jets? Here they're advertising them to fly to Nantucket, Long Island, and Martha's Vineyard. I don't understand how much jobs are created by flying to those places, but it's certainly got nothing. It's certainly got a lot to do more with resort destinations than it does to do with anything having to do with business. So let's just say that Massport is claiming these things are for business purposes. Where are all the people, all the businesses clamoring and telling us their story of how important these jets are to them and how many jobs they're creating and all this business they're creating because of these jets? There's crickets because nobody wants to talk about it. They're all embarrassed. And the only thing they're busy doing is hiding their ownership in these jets through all kinds of complicated means to prevent people from finding out who's flying them. Take, for example, the CEO of Steward Healthcare. As the Globe recently found out, that guy's flying around 2 private jets. And while his patients at the healthcare are dying from lack of appropriate medical equipment, he's flying in his jets over to France and the resort destinations over there, like the French Riviera. And I don't think he's going over there to get medical equipment to help the people in the hospital. So we have to ask ourselves what is really going on with these airplanes and what kind of benefit do they provide? Now, here's another recent private jet activity that just started, private jets for dogs. Now, this seems a little crazy, but this is actually the kind of stuff that's going on in this business. And, this is what's supporting the projected growth of the industry. Now, what I'd like to point out is they call these business jets, right? And that's a misnomer, really. They're luxury jets for convenient travel, right? But if they're business jets, is this dog going to a business meeting and going to bring home jobs to the Massachusetts economy? I don't think so. Now, in addition to the lack of societal benefit and the gross emissions these things create, they're subsidized and subsidized by you through a variety of loopholes and other techniques with the tax laws. Particularly, they have a huge number of benefits. If you buy a Toyota, you pay sales tax on it. If you buy it in New Hampshire and bring it home here, they catch you and make you pay tax on it. And not for jets. They're line itemed out right in the mass law. And if you buy a jet, it doesn't come with an interior fitted out. It costs $5 to $8 million to outfit the interior. That also is specifically exempted from sales tax. There's no property tax paid. This giant project is not subject to property tax to the extent that it's on Massport land, because Massport in its charter says Massport is for the good of the people at large, and therefore they should not have to pay taxes on anything. And the federal tax laws provide an incredible network of write-offs and breaks to incent jet ownership, including for many jet owners, they create LLCs, put their jet in it, claim they're trying to rent it to other people, say, uh-oh, it lost money, and therefore offset their other income with that loss. It goes on and on. The state and local jet fuel taxes. We can't say, oh, we don't like jets, or they have a huge impact that is not being accounted for by their costs. So we want to levy a tax on them, say to cover the social cost of carbon, for example. We can't do that. It's preempted by federal law. We're not allowed to levy a tax on the jet fuel because they're protected. And the runways and towers for all of this stuff, who pays for that? Not these jets. It's paid for on the commercial tickets that you buy on a commercial flight. Those fees go into the fund that pays all the airport improvement programs and maintenance programs, and including not just major commercial airports, but also these little private jet ports. And the FAA reauthorization bill from last year that's still trying to make its way through Congress has proposals in it to just publicly finance outright the hangars for private jets, which is just hard to understand. But they claim it's a national emergency because of the jet housing crisis. The proponent in this case has made a bunch of interesting claims and deceptive arguments that need to be addressed. They claim it's a net zero project. This is a complete farce because their claims are about offsetting the climate impacts of the things that they have on the ground, like the buildings. They're going to claim they're going to put a solar array in to cancel out the energy use of the lighting on their buildings and stuff like that. That has nothing to do with the airplanes. They're specifically denying that their activities, their net zero includes anything to do with the airplanes. Yet the equipment on the ground consumes a tiny fraction, almost 1,000 times less than the aircraft are generating. So it's ridiculous for them to claim it's a net zero project. They've said the project will not generate any new flights. Yet it has a fuel farm installed in the project, and this whole project is located at a distance from the remainder part of the airport, so it operates kind of autonomously. And that fuel farm is projected and claimed by the proponent itself that 15,000 gallons of jet fuel a day will be delivered to operate those jets. Now, those jets are clearly flying. So you're adding new jets and a fuel farm to supply them that's putting in 15,000 new gallons a day, but they're claiming it will not generate any new flights. The giant footnote on that, and the way they can get away with trying to claim that, is they're saying, we're not generating any new flights compared with the industry projections. The industry projects the growth, and they take that as an act of God and say, we had nothing to do with it, even though they're enabling it. All right. And therefore, they're claiming we didn't do it. We're not doing anything. We're not making any new flights. And finally, they said the project will theoretically reduce an unknown number of these things called ferry flights, which are flights that would have liked to have been based at Hanscom, but instead are based at some other airport and fly in with a short hop to pick somebody up and then go somewhere, fly back to Hanscom, drop them off, and go back home. So their home base is located nearby, but couldn't fit at Hanscom. And they came up with a crazy way of counting these that's very expansive. And they said, well, we know it's somewhere between 0 and 3,000. But they said, oh, it doesn't matter much anyway, because this won't really reduce. And even if we reduce these 3,000, it wouldn't be too much. Yet their whole claim of benefit of this project has a lot to do with whether it's 0 or 3,000. And despite when asked, they cannot pin down whether it is 0 or 3,000. And they've been unable to identify a single aircraft or a single airport nearby that generates these kind of flights, which is remarkable considering they have full access through Massport to all of the data necessary to answer this question. They clearly don't want to answer it. And a developer should not make misleading claims. So one of the things that is this whole project is connected to is the idea that there's an escape valve, because magically in the future, aircraft will stop emitting greenhouse gases. Isn't that nice? And that would be nice. And they've said they throw out two different sort of red herring issues on this. One is electric aircraft, and the other is sustainable aviation fuels. Electric aircraft according to the U.S. National Aviation Plan, will only displace a small number of small propeller aircraft flying over short distances and have no potential to replace jets by 2050. The fundamental reason is because batteries weigh 20 times more than jet fuel. So there's no way, if you make a plane of the same weight and you use batteries instead of jet fuel, it can only fly 10% of the distance of a jet aircraft. And there's nobody who has any idea how to make that any better. So this is a completely misleading claim, and it'll have no impact on these kind of jets. Sustainable aviation fuels are another misleading claim because, first of all, those fuels emit the same or more CO2, more greenhouse gases as jet fuel does. The only way they're supposed to benefit the planet is because when they grow, because they're based on some sort of, crop or something, when they grow, they're supposed to absorb CO2 from the air, offsetting some of what they put back out when they're burned. However, I talked to the guys who work on this at MIT, and they told me that if we made enough sustainable aviation fuel to fuel the aircraft industry, it would consume all of the arable land on Earth. Just to put it in perspective, nobody believes anything like that's going to happen. And so even the people who studied it in detail say it has very little, even a negative life cycle benefit to CO2. So this is, again, it's a misleading claim intended to divert us from dealing with the real issue. There's no known substitute for jet fuel that reduces greenhouse gases. And planning based on a magical unknown technology for the future is just not responsible. So what's the effect of this project? If we stop this project, how does it affect anything? Does it just affect Hanscom? No, it permeates through the aviation system. This is the largest jet port in New England, and there's a waiting list of people who want to buy their airplanes and fly them when they get a home to put them in. If we constrain the capacity here, it puts a constraint and pressure on the entire system. And it can reduce purchases, it can reduce current flights, and reduce private jet production going forward. It's the kind of thing we need to put the brakes on, and our policies have a ripple effect and can affect the entire system. We're not the only people also working on this. Europe is way ahead. Here is actually a picture of Greta Thunberg in the UK protesting some private jet activity there. And people over there are painting jets, gluing themselves to the runways. They've gone much more radical. They're ahead of us in terms of their concern and their rejection of this kind of use of aircraft. And we're getting a lot of incoming questions about how the other localities around the country can deal with similar projects. Ours is unique because it's the largest project in America and has drawn the most interest because of that. Many other parts of America, they build projects in smaller increments to hide them. But it's certainly true around the world that people are starting to realize this is an environmental and social justice calamity. So who can fix this? The towns have no regulatory authority over the airports. That's prohibited under federal law and state law. The legislature has no regulatory authority, believe it or not. The Massport was created under an enabling act that isolates it from the legislature, so they just can't go pass laws or anything else about it. And Massport has no power over the actual aircraft that fly there once the facilities are built. So if Massport made us a promise or tried to make us a promise saying, oh, we'll build this, but it won't actually grow the number of flights. Suppose they promised us that. They could not fulfill that promise. They can't stop the airplanes from flying. Those are their leverage on aircraft is restricted by federal law. Restricting infrastructure is the only thing we can do and the only control our state has over the growth of private luxury jets. And the Massport is the agency that controls it, and they report only to the governor. So the only leverage we have as citizens or as legislatures or anybody else is to push the governor to take them in, to take the Massport board that she appoints. But, and of course, they were appointed prior to her getting here, but she has a lot of leverage with the board and is right now appointing a new director for it. She has a lot of power to tell them, hey, yeah, there's some things you guys should do, but this is not one of them. And so this is why we have a central point of focus for this project, which is talk to the governor. And her staff is well aware. They didn't start this project, and they were upset to receive it when they took office. And they're doing a great job to try and help figure out how to get out of it. And we have to, but they need a lot of political cover and support to do that. So what are we trying to say, really? We were trying to say there shouldn't be any private jet infrastructure built anywhere because it's antithetical to the state and federal emissions plans. And I'd just like to say that, 20 years ago in this country, people projected the use of coal was inevitable and it was going to grow for the foreseeable future, and people were planning around it. And there was over 100 coal plants in development at that time, and permitting and some form of the project. Since that time, we had a big wake-up call in America, and we put the brakes on, and not one of those 100 plants ever got built. So it just shows if we do wake up and take a position, we can stop these things, even when people say they're inevitable and they're going to happen anywhere. Forget that. We can stop it. And it comes down to one thing. Don't build it, and they won't come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. We must protect all from the vandalism of a few, and that is exactly the right citation for Concordians and for all the people who have joined us this evening. Our next speaker this evening is Chuck Collins. He's the director, and I just want to remind people, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We will try to get to as many of those questions as we can this evening. If we don't get to all of them, the chat box will continue to exist, and we will try to put up responses to the questions that you're asking on our website as we go forward. Chuck Collins is an amazing man. He's the director of the program on inequality and common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. Could there be a more appropriate title for what we're talking about tonight? He is the author of 9 books on wealth inequality, including, it's my favorite, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. Now, I like just one of those little millions would be fine with me. How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. And Altar to an Erupting Sun, a novel. He is co-author of a report released last October, Hanscom High Flyers, Private Jet Excess Doesn't Justify Airport Expansion. Welcome, Chuck. We look forward to hearing from you tonight.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Neil, as always, for putting that context together. I offer up this image for us just to think about what it is we're trying to prevent. And I want to start by just underscoring what's driving the demand for private jets and for the expansion of the private jet sector. And I think it's just important to understand the demand for private jets is a symptom. It is the result of this extraordinary concentration of wealth and power, this updraft of wealth to not just the 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. In 1982, there were 13 billionaires in the United States. Now there's 750. You can be sure that most of them have at least one jet, if not two. And next slide, just to show a firm called WealthX, which is actually a company that analyzes and sells data to vendors of private jets, analyzed what's the median wealth of people who own private jets. And the median wealth of a US private jet owner is $190 million. And the next slide shows the median wealth of a fractional jet owner, somebody who has like a timeshare interest in a jet, doesn't own the jet or shares ownership of the jet. So this just shows we're talking about a demand, and you can see in many ways how the consumption desires of the ultra wealthy are driving the economy. If you drive down into Boston to the Back Bay or down near the Fenway, you will see the rise of luxury condominiums, the demand for yachts. All of this is part of this overall trend of luxury consumption. The developers of the proposed Northfield project have said, well, we're talking to potential clients. These are people who want to have jets at Hanscom. And so what we did, we did an analysis, and we did a report that looked over 18 months at how is Hanscom currently being used. What are the what do we know about the flights coming and going? And Neil made a really important point, which is Massport has this data, and yet here we are, a private research group, having to pay to get access to the public registry of private jet data so that we can do some analysis of who's currently using the airport and how it's being used. And so we did an analysis looking over the entire year in 2022 and half of 2023. We found that, and the sample is a little bit smaller for the reason that Neil suggested, which is the private jet lobby has passed legislation, has pressed the FAA to allow private jet operators to opt out of public tracking registries. So many of the biggest billionaires in Massachusetts who own private jets, Robert Kraft and John Henry and others, are not on the public registries. So we know that what we looked at was roughly 70% of the flights that come and go out of Hanscom. And what we found is that more than half go to luxury destinations. And we were fairly conservative in how we define that. But these are destinations like Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard. We found over almost 51% of flights in and out of Hanscom coming and going from luxury destinations. Let me just name a few of those. A huge number to Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, the Hamptons of New York, West Palm Beach, Jackson Hole, Aruba, Tortola, Antigua, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Aspen, the Turks and Caicos, Palermo, Italy, Barcelona, Spain. Now, some of these you could say might be business travel related. We took that into allowance. We didn't include, for instance, flights to New York, even though people may have been going to New York or other urban areas for recreational or luxury purposes. And it may be that on some of those flights, business was discussed when they were playing golf in Aberdeen, Scotland. One of the frequent flyers in and out of Hanscom, John Childs, has a bird hunting preserve in Argentina. Maybe he's discussing business while he's in Argentina. But this is just an indication that these are not necessarily business necessity flights. They are a huge percentage of luxury flights. And if we could look at the next slide. So here's just a summary. We looked at 31,599 private jet flights. Half of them were to luxury destinations. Next slide. And actually, let's skip this slide. And among the most frequent users of Hanscom, here's one interesting observation. These frequent users, the 20 top users, actually Herb Chambers was number 21, so he's not on the top list. But 7 of these are individuals closely affiliated with private equity firms in Boston. Their jets are active. The number one frequent flyer jet in and out of Hanscom in the period we looked at in the 18 months took 387 flights, roughly a flight every other day. Wasn't necessarily the individual beneficial owner. It was probably leased out or rented out, but huge amount of activity. 112 of those flights in and out of Nantucket, 110 in and out of Teterboro outside New York. So these are airports and destinations where there are other transportation alternatives that have a lower emissions impact. Next slide. So just to show, those were the top 20. There are among the wealthiest billionaires, John Fish, John Childs, Arthur Demoulas. Those three billionaires alone uh, were accounted for a huge number of flights and carbon emissions. The next slide. And actually the next slide. And just to show, there are transportation alternatives, but just to imagine New York to Boston or New York to DC, you can see the comparison of transportation alternatives, private jet versus commercial versus a train versus a bus. Tremendous difference. And so what happens, as Neil suggests, if they don't expand Hanscom? These are people with tremendous wealth and capacity, and they will find other transportation alternatives. Next slide, just to underscore a point that Neil made, we, the public, subsidize these airspace. Not only are we subsidizing their emissions, but we're subsidizing their use of the airspace. Private aviation flights take up 1 out of 6 flights, roughly 16, 17% of the total flights handled by the FAA, but they only chip in about 2% of the revenue required to operate those facilities. So again, underscoring what Neil said, these are commercial flights. We, commercial passengers and taxpayers, are the subsidizing the private jet and general aviation airspace. Next slide, I want to just talk a little bit about sustainable aviation fuels. Neil underscored this well. This is what we're hearing. First, just to understand, the folks who are pushing this airport expansion are the most wealthy and powerful people on the planet. And the private jet lobby is a formidable lobbying organization. They get their way. The reason why I have to pay a sales tax to purchase a bicycle in Massachusetts, but I don't have to pay a sales tax by owning a private jet, is because of their power, the power to influence legislation and lobby. And we're going to be hearing a lot about sustainable aviation fuel because that is really all they've got in response to the emissions issues. And what I would underscore is sustainable aviation fuels. That is a marketing term that's been created by the aviation industry. There are alternative fuels and there are alternative sources of electricity to power aircraft. But kind of like if you're a consumer and you're going to the supermarket and you see something that says natural food, I want you, when you hear the phrase sustainable aviation fuels, like when you see the label natural food, I want you to say, what are the ingredients? And there's 4 really important questions. What's the source of the fuels? Are they, biofuels? Are they displacing food? Are they going to require deforestation to grow more palm oil and other sources of biofuels? What's the scale and timetable? For 10 years, we've been hearing about sustainable aviation fuels and the plans to scale them up, but they have missed those benchmarks continually. At this point, so-called sustainable aviation fuels account for 0.1% of jet fuel. The other question we want to ask is, what are the competing decarbonization needs? If we're going to be allocating biofuels and other croplands and other sources of non-fossil fuel sources for aviation, what about the displacement? What about more important needs such as heating, ground transportation, building heating, and other uses of fuel? So what will the sustainable aviation fuels be competing with? And finally, what's the subsidies required? We already know that the private jet lobby and others are lobbying for huge subsidies to expand the so-called biofuel sector. I just want to make one more point, maybe in the next, to the next slide. As you reflect on this, actually go back to, as you reflect on this image, Neil talked about the arguments about ferrying flights. And I can say that we looked at this data. We looked at how is the current airport being used? How many of those 31,000 flights conceivably could be fairing flights? And it's very few. I identified one, Arthur Demoulas, Arthur S. Demoulas of the Market Basket fame, who tried to oust his cousin from the company, owns a private jet, comes in and out of Hanscom, periodically flies to Nashua. There's a situation. It doesn't really make sense, obviously, to fly from Hanscom to Nashua. That might be a scenario where we identified as a potential ferry flight, meaning the jet is parked in Nashua and comes in and out of Hanscom. But we're talking about fewer than 1% of the flights. That is the justification. When you hear the developer's case, and on their website, they actually say, this project will provide service and storage options, and improve the efficiency, and potentially reduce arrivals and departures that exist solely to move aircraft that cannot be stored at Hanscom Field. Just to understand the level of smokescreen there. And again, that data is available to find out, what number of actual fairing flights there are, and we have not seen that data. So I want you to just, as I close, look at this image and think about what it is we're working against when we say no new private jet infrastructure. Blowing off a carbon bomb of emissions so that the ultra-rich can jet to Nantucket or New York or anywhere is indefensible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chuck, for reminding us of the moral dimension of all of this. When we think of these flights going to local, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little message here that I'm going to just omit. Flying to Aruba and flying to Turks and Caicos is not necessarily a business flight. And Chuck, your work has been seminal in helping us to understand. Remind people to put your questions in the chat box. And before we go any further, I just want to remind us that the Bridge in Concord, a local newspaper, commented that the hangars have gone from 27 hangars to 17. Neil made it very clear to us in the beginning, for those of you who joined a little bit later, that in point of fact, that means no diminution in terms of the vast scope of physical space that these hangars will be taking up. It's a ruse. And so we need to pay very attention to what appears to be one thing, but is in reality another. Thank you, Chuck, so much. Our final and extraordinarily important speaker is Alex Chatfield. He's a clinical social worker and member of the Lincoln Democratic Town Committee who has lived in Lincoln for 27 years. He works at Minuteman ARC in Concord, where he is a director of the Early Intervention Program. He was recently appointed by the Select Board to be the Lincoln representative to the Massport Community Advisory Council. He's a member of several climate action organizations, including St. Anne's Lincoln Climate Justice Ministry. As a member, therefore, of various climate-related campaigns, Alex joined the coalition to stop private jet expansion in May of 2023. Alex, you're an inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. These slides are going to be a little bit repetitious, which is why I'm going to go through them very quickly. Quite a few of us on this webinar have had the opportunity to sit through the slideshows and presentations that the proponents of the project have been doing recently. The more we listen, the more we are identifying misleading and incomplete information. And quite honestly, the case that they're now making for the project, it appears weaker and more flawed each time they do it. Nevertheless, if you aren't initiated into all of these facts, it can be a little bit difficult to spot the problems because they are doing a very, very thorough job of greenwashing the project in general and minimizing the harm to the climate. So, for example, as Diane mentioned, on one of the very first slides they are proud to say that they've reduced the number of hangars from 27 to 17, but it is only at the end of the presentation when someone asks, does that mean that there are any fewer square feet? that they will admit, no, it's still 500,000 square feet. The hangars are just bigger. Again, we have to emphasize this point. Anytime you hear Massport talking about its sustainability plan and the plan for these facilities, when they say that they are sustainable or when they say that they will be net zero, they are only talking about buildings. They do not count what comes out of the planes in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, as crazy as that sounds. And again, just to reiterate what Neil said earlier, even before they do this expansion, we believe that the current flight load of jets at Hanscom is canceling out the climate benefits of half the solar panels we have ever put up in Massachusetts. Next slide. So I'll just mention one or two of these. Again, reiterate, they are building a so-called fuel farm. Isn't that a nice euphemism? That can hold 80,000 gallons of fuel at a time. They have admitted that over 5 million gallons of fuel, jet fuel, will be delivered to the fuel farm annually. But again, with the greenwashing, they are saying that as soon as sustainable aviation fuel is available, they'll be able to put it in the fuel farm. One of the problems, besides the fact that we don't expect abundant supplies of sustainable aviation fuels to be available, is that Massport has no authority at all to mandate that people using the airport need to use the sustainable aviation fuel. So as long as it is cheaper to use conventional fuel, that's what's going to go in the planes. So they like to talk about it. The reality is it's not going to make any difference. And they have largely abandoned any data or any assertion that the ferry flight issue is real, that they can put a number to it, that they're willing to stand by. And at best, they are saying now that the project only has the potential to reduce the flights, not that it will reduce the flights. Next slide. So many people have been asking great questions in the chat about, well, tell us more about the campaign. What have you been doing? Have you been addressing Massport? What are your strategies and tactics? And what I can tell you is we have employed many different kinds of conventional advocacy. And if you want to see the evidence for that, all you have to do is go to our fantastic website at spje.org. That is an abundant source of information and examples of many of the activities, including the petition, which you can still sign, including the many kinds of demonstrations and rallies that we've carried out, the letters that we've written, the towns that we have organized to participate in our municipal campaign. So just take a look at this list and visit the website. We urge you to sign if you haven't signed the petition. If you're part of an organization that can support our cause, contact us, and we will be happy to have you join our coalition. Municipal lobbying is very, very important. And now I just want to go into a little bit more depth about what's happening immediately this month with the release of the Draft Environmental Impact Report, or DEIR. So in terms of that, the process has been under an environmental review with the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act office really for more than a year now. In February of last year, the first document was produced by the developers, and that was the environmental notification form. And that let the community know that the scope and scale of this project was so enormous, specifically the 38 acres of new pavement that has to be installed, where there is now a very nice large stand of mature trees that have to be clear cut and paved. The environmental notification form kicked off a couple of weeks of public comments that occurred a year ago. And even though that was a very short period of time, we were able to generate 350 public comments. And that kicked off the review process, which has lasted a year, much longer than anticipated. And one of the key players at the beginning and now coming up is Environmental Affairs Secretary Rebecca Tepper. And she really took a very strong stand at the beginning of the process, requiring a long, very detailed list of questions that the proponents of the project need to answer. And that is an example of information that you can find at our website. So the scope was laid out. They have gone to work. They have all kinds of consultants working with them. They're working hand in glove with Massport. And we are anticipating that the report will be filed by March 15th and subsequently made available to the public March 22nd. This will kick off another period of public comments. We do anticipate that it will be longer than 2 weeks. I've heard 30 days or longer. So there should be plenty of time for people to be able to submit those comments to the Mass Environmental Policy Act office. And we will have lots of information on the website about how that works. You can send an email, you can write them a letter, etc. And these public comments are very, very important because under the law, the respondents must respond to the public comments that they receive and answer the questions that are in those comments. And the size of the response is going to be one of the things that's going to influence the administration as to how they receive the report. Secretary Tepper does have the authority to send the report back to the developers if she finds that it is incomplete, that the data is faulty, that their analysis doesn't make sense. And this will be part of the process that could delay the production of the final report, which is really the third of the 3 reports. There's the initial, then the draft, and then the final. So we are hoping to at least double the number of comments that are submitted this time around, which would be around 700. But there's no reason that we can't have more than that. And we do feel that this is an important way to influence the outcome of the process. So at this point, just to summarize and to sort of add my view, I must admit that even though I've considered myself to be a climate activist for the last 10 years and have participated in many actions related to fossil fuel pipelines and to greening our electric grid and shutting down the last coal-burning electric power plant in New England, which is in Bow, New Hampshire, I was not paying a lot of attention to planes. And I kind of thought in my own naive way that somewhere somebody had a plan to actually begin reducing emissions from planes. And the fact is there is no credible plan for doing that. The industry will talk about sustainable fuels and electric planes. This is not going to solve the problem. In the long run, if emissions from the aviation industry are going to decline, it will mean that in general, but especially with regarding private jets, as we've seen, people will need to fly less. And that is a sacrifice that as a society we need to consider because it's more important to have a viable climate and a safe planet to live on than it is to fly for frivolous reasons. And there are no more frivolous reasons to fly than getting on a private jet so that you can have the ultimate in luxury and convenience at the expense of the rest of society. So the fact that Massport is engaging in this plan is not a surprise. Their charter is 7 years old, and it was created at a time when growing aviation was seen as an unmitigated societal and economic good. And that is no longer the case. The same is true for the FAA at the federal level. And these organizations work hand in hand to ensure that the industry is protected from any meaningful regulation regarding climate change. And until we begin to win some fights like this, that will continue. And so I can't stress enough how important it is that if we are able to persuade our governor, who claims to be our climate champion and leader, if we can persuade her to use all of her authority and influence to cancel this project, it will be the shot heard round the country at airports to say enough is enough, endless growth is not feasible, and the people are rising up and saying no more. So be a part of it. Join us. Thank you for coming tonight. And we're over time as far as the presentation goes. So I'm going to stop, and we would love to address some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You have been, your clarity of mind and voice are an inspiration, Alex. And I thank you so very, very much. In the chat box, you will see a link to several things. One, a way to sign a petition. And secondly, to get to our website, which is full of information. There are so many powerful questions online. And although we planned some questions ahead of time, I'm going to skip our planned questions and go right to those that are in the chat box. So again, if you have a question, we're not going to be able to call on people, Don, individually, but if you put it in the chat box, that would be fantastic. Let's start with the very first one we identified, which is Carl Popolo, who asked, in her introduction, Naomi said that private jet operations have emissions of 45 times that of commercial flights. Is the 45 times per flight or per passenger mile? In other words, does it matter how many people are on the plane when it takes off?
Yes. It's per passenger mile.
It's per passenger mile. So it does matter.
Yes.
Thank you, Neil, so much. So that's a succinct and clear response to Carl's question. Catherine Rifkin commented, please mention leaded avgas, and that we are living under a plume of lead pollution already. Can any of the three of you address that concern right now?
Sure. The avgas is only used by piston aircraft, not by jets. So that has nothing to do with this project. Although, strangely enough, in their fuel farm for this project, they have a fuel tank for leaded avgas, which doesn't make total sense. But the reason it makes sense is because adjacent to this project, last year they completed another set of small hangars that service prop aircraft that'll use that. So the use of leaded avgas is an obscenity. It shouldn't happen. It continues to go on, although every few years there's all this machinations about outlawing it, but it hasn't been outlawed. It's a terrible shame. And Hanscom Field is probably one of the single largest point sources of lead emissions into the atmosphere in New England. Probably the biggest.
I also want to point out that when we are talking about stop private jet expansion, we're talking about business jets. There are a lot of kind of recreational pilots who fly in and out of Hanscom, and many of them have misunderstood the effort that we're undertaking. We're not trying to stop those folks. What we're trying to stop is the big private jet business, supposedly business flights that are the major pollutants. So if you have a neighbor, for instance, who has a small plane and does a lot of flying and says, "Oh, I've got to get in the way of these people who are trying to stop it," they are not the folks that we are addressing in this plan. Alyssa Nicole asks, I've heard that the hangars will provide space for private jets currently stored elsewhere, like Logan, that would like to get them moved out of Logan. Is it true that this project provides only for existing jets, or does it provide space also for to be constructed jets?
That's totally false. Massport has said repeatedly, there are no private jets based at Logan Airport, zero. So even if there are private jets located somewhere that would rather relocate here, they're not coming from Logan. In fact, if we build the hangars here next to Logan, those people who want to use a private jet for Logan might store them here and fly into Logan to pick these people up, generating ferry flights from Hanscom to Logan. So the only effect this can have on Logan is to increase the flights.
Thank you again for the clarity and succinctness of that response, Neil. Nolaski, and excuse me if I mispronounce any names here, Hood, commented, the consultant declared that the scenario they are modeling in the DEIR is +3 daily flight increase by 2030. And Massport suggests that this will help ease congestion at Logan that is nearly around 900 flights a day today and likely more than 1,000 by 2030. This defies logic. Can you comment?
Again, it has nothing to do with Logan, right? This is not, it's a reliever for Logan in the sense that it prevents propeller planes and other kinds of aircraft from using Logan by existing here. But there's not an activity that makes them move from one airport to another. Like I said before, the only scenario that's plausible right now is people who want to fly out of Logan who cannot park their plane there. There is no space for that at Logan. They would park at Hanscom, and then the plane just flies for 3 minutes into Logan, picks them up and takes off and goes somewhere and comes back and then stores at Hanscom. That's going to create, every trip then would create 2 extra flights through Logan. You know, one to go in and one to take off. So it really, there's no way this is helping Logan. The only consequence this can have is to put more load on Logan.
I was just going to add that, I think the scenario the developers are putting forward is there are people whose jets are at Pease in Portsmouth or some of the regional airports, but they would like to be based at Hanscom. That they have identified clients. That's what they actually call them. They know a lot about the clients that want to have ferry flights, but they know nothing else they haven't disclosed much about their clients, about their other jet travel needs. What I'm saying, if the expansion mirrors the current uses of Hanscom, yeah, there might be a few so-called ferry flights. It is going to be minuscule compared to the volume of other flights originating and arriving at Hanscom that are going much other destinations. So it's incumbent on these folks to show us the data, to show us the market studies, to show us whatever show us how much of the existing flights in and out of Hanscom are so-called ferry flights. Show us those scenarios, and they have not produced that information.
And as Chuck said, he identified one plane that is exhibiting these, and separate investigations found that one too. But if it's like that's all, or 1 or 2 of these planes doing this, they're putting a space in not for 1 or 2 planes. They're putting a space in for 80 or 85 planes. So all those additional planes over the 1 or 2, like, 83 or 84 planes, those are all generating new flights and creating a whole new set of carbon emissions.
Thank you so much for both of you. Don Drinkwater asks, can somebody speak to why a small jet uses so much more fuel than a commercial jet? Is there an algorithm that relates the size of the plane to its efficiency?
When you say they don't create more, they don't create more emissions or use more fuel than a large jet. But a large jet, it's per passenger mile, this computation, as we mentioned in the first question. So if you have a giant jet, it holds, 250 people, whereas these littler jets hold only like 5 people. But the difference in the fuel they use is not of that kind of nature, like 100 to 1 or 50 to 1 or something, fuel difference. It's only like 10 to 1. So there's a huge penalty when you fly in the littler jet as far as its fuel efficiency.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Linda Weinstein asked, if Hanscom does not expand, is there a chance that these frustrated flyers will go elsewhere, to New Hampshire, etc.?
Remember what this is about. They're not, it's convenience. People want a plane, their plane, near where they live. Now, so the idea that they'll go put it somewhere else or put their plane somewhere else, it defeats the whole purpose, right? It's not convenient anymore. So what we do by making it more and more convenient, we encourage more and more people to use this form of transportation. And they're building it out in front of the actual need. They're building it so they will come, right? So this is like really a crazy way of looking at it, and it's not. And so it's not real that they would. Maybe the person who wants to fly a plane, if they can't do it here, will go find an airport in New Hampshire and move to New Hampshire to be near his airport. I don't know, but they're certainly not going to just live in Winchester and put their plane up in New Hampshire.
Exactly. Thank you. Liz Keller asked, what strategies do the speakers believe would be most effective in stopping the Hanscom expansion? And Alex, this may be your question.
Yes, I would say that the very core of our strategy from the beginning has really been to focus on demonstrating to Governor Healy that there is overwhelming political opposition to this project from citizens, from elected officials, from legislators. And, she campaigned very, very hard as a climate champion and promised a very different kind of leadership from our former governor. And honestly, has picked some excellent people to be part of her administration. However, we want to send the message, not only is this project terrible, but you really cannot build a legacy as a climate leader while tolerating this project getting built. It sends absolutely the wrong message. So she's going to need to choose what to do, and we need to hold her accountable for that leadership.
And we sent her hundreds of postcards as well, saying, please take responsibility, Chuck.
I would just underscore that we can't underestimate the power of this private jet lobby. I mean, the Mass Business Aviation Association, which is sort of the state chapter of the National Business Aviation Association, they are a powerful group lobbying on behalf of the wealthiest people in the Commonwealth. So what we need to do is create a countervailing people power to push back, to basically say, these communities, the entire Commonwealth, this is not in anyone's interest. And, all of us have to make changes in our lives to decarbonize our lives. Each of us, are making those kind of choices and actions. And the people who are flying private jets need to change their behavior. They need to fly less and stop flying private jets. We all need to change our behavior. And this is where we start. This is where we all start.
Thank you, Chuck. This is where the rubber, as they say, hits the road. And if you don't believe that Alex lives by that, I hope you've noticed his heat pump in the back, which shows that he walks the talk.
I'm warm and toasty. That's for sure, right here.
Sue Donaldson asks, who is pushing the government to approve this? Who benefits besides the jet owners? Really important question.
I feel like I just spoke to that, which is, that there are, a handful of these large private equity firms, a lot of companies that are actually investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure are 7 of the top 20 frequent flyers in and out of Hanscom. Their jets, the jets that are owned by their leaders. So yeah, the most wealthy and powerful people in the Commonwealth are pushing for this. So that's who benefits. Now, the Mass Business Aviation Association will reel off a lot of statistics about Hanscom, the jobs that are going to be created, high-paying jobs. Look, anything we do around green infrastructure, retrofitting buildings, improving the quality of life, all the investments we're making to decarbonize other aspects of the economy are also creating good jobs. So we can't just say this is a jobs argument. They will say, well, this is going to help all these people who go to work at Hanscom. Well, there's plenty of good work to be done creating a green economy in the Commonwealth.
But there sure is. Lowry Hempel asked, I'm concerned about the 5.4 million gallons of new jet fuel that will need to be trucked into Hanscom. Where does this fuel come from? Will it mostly come down Route 2 from Boston?
I believe it's going to come in Hartwell Avenue and then cross through the back roads to get into this side of the airport. It doesn't, so it'll come off of 128 through the exit that leads to Hartwell Avenue. It won't come in Route 2.
It won't come in Route 2.
No.
Not
But
that
it'll wind its way up through these little back streets in Bedford.
Yeah, not that that should be a consolation.
No,
Not at
no.
all. Okay. Amy McCoy asked, do you think the hangars will increase ferry flights to all of the surrounding airports, extending their runways such as Lawrence, Plymouth, and Norwood? And may I just ask that one of you, again, for people who may have joined late, define what a ferry flight is?
So the ferry flight, it's very confusing because a ferry flight technically is any repositioning flight that has no people on board. So that includes all kinds of crazy flights that have nothing to do with hangars. For example, if you're an air taxi like an Uber, you're driving around in between pickups and you're dispatched to your next location and you're flying with, you're driving with no passenger. And that's the same thing with timeshares and all these other kinds of taxi services. So most of these ferry flights, the vast majority, are part of the business model and are completely unaffected by the presence of a hangar anywhere. The planes are just moving around because they're not all owned by one person. They jump between airports, go where they're called, like a taxi. And so the only ferry flights that are of interest here are ones due to planes that couldn't find a home at Hanscom. So they went and found a home, say in Nashua, New Hampshire, and they fly and they park the plane there and they got themselves a hangar there. And then every time they want to fly out of Hanscom, the plane takes off from Nashua, flies to Hanscom, picks them up, goes somewhere, then comes back, drops them off at Hanscom, and then returns to Nashua. Those are the type of ferry flights that the proponent has claimed they might reduce. But when you look at so the question is, how many are there of those and what drives them? It's driven by convenience, lack of hangar space near the point of convenience. But it's a big pain in the neck to keep your plane somewhere that's not near you. So it's not desirable. And a lot, as you can find out from what Massport is saying, a lot of people are on a waiting list and have not bought their plane until they find a hangar at Hanscom. So there are no ferry flights generated by those. However, when these hangars are built at Hanscom, it will create a source of high-end hangars that allow Hanscom to provide a source of ferry flights to other airports. Specifically, Logan is the big one. Because you're a rich person flying out of Boston. You don't want to be up in Portsmouth or in Nashua or Keene, New Hampshire. You want to be at a real airport like Hanscom. And so I believe that's really what the issue is here. And the effect on ferry flights will primarily be to create more to service Logan. But right now we have no evidence that there's any that are any ferry flights that are coming through Hanscom that would be relieved, other than that one example. And maybe there's another one here and there. And that's all we've been able to find.
Thank you, Neil, so much. There are other wonderful questions in the chat box, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. I feel if we had another hour, we would have a chance for even more questions. I want to end by thanking first Professor Oreskes, who is no longer, I think, on the call, but want to thank her publicly. I want to thank Neil for his extraordinary research, Chuck for his remarkable research, and Alex for your soul, which is deep and rich and keeps all of us going. John Lewis said, when you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state, it is an act. And each generation must do its part to help build what we call this beloved country, a nation and a world and a society of peace with itself. And I would end with something rather surprising, I think. When Alexei Navalny, the recent victim of Putin's autocracy, was asked what message he would leave for the Russian people if he were killed, he said, "Listen, I've got something very obvious to tell you. You're not allowed to give up. If they decide to kill me, it means that we are incredibly strong. We need to utilize this power not to give up, to remember we are a huge power that is being oppressed by these bad dudes. We don't realize how strong we actually are. We are strong, particularly when we act in concert and together, acting with informed clarity, mixed with a kind of persistent determination, may be the way to disarm those who say, oh, Massport, they're just going to do what they want to do. Let us make certain that's not true. Thank you, everyone who joined us. Thank you for an enlightening evening, and I wish you all a healthy and lovely evening. Thank you.